Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a moment in history that feels less like a thunderous battle cry and more like a collective, confused whisper. You find yourself standing on the cusp of an era-defining conflict, a war that everyone expects to explode, but somehow doesn't. Imagine the air thick with tension, the kind that hums in your ears, making every distant sound seem like the prelude to chaos. You brace for impact, for the earth to shake, for the sky to light up with fire, but instead you get crickets. It's a bit like preparing for the most epic, high-stakes exam of your life, only to find out it's been mysteriously postponed indefinitely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there, a phantom observer in September 1939, the air still warm with the lingering breath of summer, yet chilled by a new, unsettling breeze. The news has just broken, a seismic shift rumbling across the airwaves, echoing from the crackling radios in every quiet living room, whispered from newspaper headlines clutched in trembling hands. War. The word itself feels like a heavy cloak draped over Europe, promising darkness and a storm of unimaginable fury. You might expect, given the gravity of such a declaration, to hear the immediate roar of cannons, the distant thud of bombs, the frantic scramble of nations throwing themselves into the fray. But what you hear instead is silence. An unearthly, profound quiet that settles over Western Europe like a thick, unexpected fog. It's almost comical, if the stakes weren't so terrifyingly real. You picture the scene, leaders in grand, ornate rooms, their voices solemn, their words weighty with destiny, announcing that the world has irrevocably changed. And then nothing. It's as if someone pressed the Start War button, and the game console just froze, displaying a blank screen. You had been bracing for the crescendo, the dramatic orchestral swell, and instead, you got a sustained, almost awkward pause. It's like waiting for a grand fireworks display, only for the first firework to gently fizzle out, leaving you staring at an empty sky, wondering if you missed something. The declarations were undeniably real, though. You rewind time just a touch, to the early hours of September 1st, 1939, when German forces, with chilling precision, rolled across the border into Poland. This was the spark, the undeniable transgression that finally broke the fragile peace. For 2 frantic days, the world held its breath, hoping against hope that diplomacy, that desperate last-minute pleas, might somehow avert the inevitable. But it was not to be. Then, on September 3rd, 1939, the echoes began. At 11:15 a.m., British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, his voice heavy with regret, announced to his nation that they were now at war with Germany. A few hours later, France followed suit. This is your mainstream historical fact, by the way, the precise timing of these declarations, a cascade of fateful decisions. You can almost feel the collective sigh of resignation that rippled across millions of homes as the news sank in. Yet, despite these solemn pronouncements, a strange anticlimax permeated the air. You look out over the quiet streets of London, where sandbags are piled against public buildings and windows are taped to prevent shattering. You see the hurried evacuations of children from cities to the countryside, a mass movement born of fear and foresight. But the expected aerial bombardments, the terrifying raids that everyone had been told to prepare for, simply don't materialize. The air raid sirens, which had blared a false alarm in London just minutes after Chamberlain's declaration, quickly fell silent, leaving behind a ringing quiet that felt even more unsettling than the blare itself. This immediate, phantom air raid warning, followed by an eerie calm, is your quirky historical tidbit. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, quickly followed by a shiver of confusion. What exactly were they waiting for? You find yourself in a world teetering on the brink, but not falling. It's a moment of profound psychological tension, where the expectation of terror is almost worse than the terror itself. You picture families huddled around their radios, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering light of a single lamp, listening to the news bulletins. They're told they are at war. They've prepared for it for months, even years. Gas masks have been distributed, trenches dug in parks, blackout curtains meticulously fitted. And then they wait, and wait. And the silence stretches, long and thin, like a wire pulled taut across the continent. This wasn't merely a lack of immediate action, it was a profound, almost philosophical stillness. You could feel the weight of unspoken questions in the air. Why wasn't Germany attacking? Were they consolidating? Were they bluffing? And why weren't the Allies launching a full-scale offensive to support Poland, which was being brutally overrun even as the declarations were being made? Historians still argue whether the Allies' initial passivity was a calculated strategic move, born of a deep reluctance to engage in another devastating land war, or a symptom of profound unpreparedness and a lack of unified resolve. It's a debate that echoes through the quiet halls of academic institutions even now. You can almost hear the soft rustle of old papers as scholars deliberate this strange initial inertia. You walk through the phantom streets of Paris, where the café tables remain mostly empty, and the usual bustle has been replaced by a hushed apprehension. People speak in low tones, their eyes darting, as if expecting the peace to shatter at any moment. There's a peculiar kind of psychological warfare at play, even without a shot fired. The sheer anticipation, the unknown, begins to gnaw at the edges of daily life. It's like being stuck in a perpetual loading screen, where the progress bar is stuck at 0%, and you have no idea if the program has crashed or is just taking its sweet time. The irony is not lost on you. Here you are, a world at war, but the battlefield is eerily quiet. It's a war declared, but not yet fought, at least not in the grand, sweeping way everyone anticipated. You might imagine the generals poised over maps, their fingers tracing lines of attack, only to pull back, perhaps clearing their throats awkwardly and saying, "Right, well, perhaps we'll just wait a bit." It's an almost absurd tableau, this collective holding of breath, this global game of chicken where no one seems to want to make the first move in the West. This period, this strange, quiet interlude, would eventually be given a name, a rather fittingly understated one. But for now, in these early September days, it was simply the war, a new, terrifying reality that had been declared but had yet to show its true face. You can feel the profound uncertainty, the collective anxiety that hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud that refuses to break. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car backfiring, every unexpected shadow seems to hold a hidden menace. You're waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it just hovers. It's a war of nerves, playing out not on battlefields, but in the quiet, anxious hearts of millions. The world held its breath, waiting for the storm to break, for the inevitable chaos to erupt. But September 1939 passed, and then October, and the quiet persisted. The declarations had echoed, yes, but the expected cataclysm remained stubbornly, unsettlingly, absent from Western Europe. It was a strange, unsettling paradox, at war but not fighting. A global conflict, yet a local calm. And you, the observer, are left to ponder this profound stillness, this peculiar opening act to a drama that everyone knew was coming, but had yet to begin its violent crescendo. The quiet was deafening, a prelude to something vast and terrible, but for now it was just quiet. As the world held its breath, expecting the thunderous crack of battle to follow the solemn declarations of war in September 1939, something utterly unexpected happened. Instead of the immediate, cataclysmic conflict everyone had braced for, a profound, almost unbelievable quiet settled over Western Europe. Imagine standing on a vast, open plain, having just heard the starting pistol fire for a race, only to find that all the other runners are simply standing there. No one moves. The air hangs heavy, not with the dust of marching armies or the distant rumble of artillery, but with an eerie, unsettling stillness. You might find yourself walking down a cobbled street in a European capital, perhaps London or Paris, and the expected chaos, the urgent rush of wartime mobilization, simply isn't there. Oh sure, the sandbags are piled high outside public buildings, and the air raid shelters are marked with their stark, reassuring signs. You see the blackouts beginning to take hold as evening descends, plunging familiar avenues into an unfamiliar gloom. But the sirens, the ones that were supposed to wail with terrifying regularity, remain silent. The skies, which everyone assumed would soon be filled with the roar of bombers, are instead home to the gentle drift of autumn clouds, undisturbed. It's like being at a concert where the orchestra has tuned up, the conductor has raised his baton, and then everyone just holds their breath. For months. This wasn't merely a brief pause, it was an extended, almost theatrical interlude. An unprecedented stillness descended, blanketing the continent in a thick, almost palpable quiet. Nations, governments, and ordinary citizens alike were left to ponder this bizarre, unsettling, and utterly unprecedented situation. What was supposed to be the opening act of a global tragedy had instead become a prolonged, silent tableau. It was, to put it mildly, confusing. You can almost hear the collective scratching of heads across Europe. Are we at war? Or are we just really, really good at pretending? The term that eventually emerged to describe this period, the Phoney War, or in German, Sitzkrieg, the sitting war, perfectly encapsulates its absurdity. Imagine the soldiers, dug into their trenches or nestled in their bunkers, polishing their boots for the 10th time that week, perhaps even exchanging pleasantries with the occasional confused squirrel. One could almost picture a bored German sentry waving politely across the field to a British Tommy, both wondering if they should be doing something more warlike, like, say, fighting. It was less a war and more an extremely tense, very expensive staring contest. This was not a period of peace, mind you. Far from it. The declarations had been made, the lines drawn, and the stakes were impossibly high. But the expected collision of armies simply did not materialize. Instead, an almost psychological warfare took hold, a waiting game that gnawed at the edges of sanity. You could feel it in the air, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily life. It was the quiet before the storm, but a quiet so profound and so prolonged that it began to feel like a storm that had forgotten to arrive. It was like waiting for your internet to connect, and the little spinning will just keep spinning, indefinitely, making you wonder if you should restart the router or just give up on the modern world entirely. Governments, accustomed to the swift, brutal logic of previous conflicts, found themselves in an awkward limbo. How do you rally a nation for a war that refuses to begin? How do you maintain morale when the enemy is an invisible, silent threat? The British War Cabinet, for instance, spent a significant amount of time debating the proper use of gas masks and blackout curtains, rather than coordinating grand offensives. It was all very proper, very British, and very, very quiet on the Western Front. For the average person, this stillness was a strange blend of relief and dread. On one hand, the bombs weren't falling, the sons and husbands weren't dying in droves. There was a fragile, precious continuation of ordinary routine. On the other hand, the sword of Damocles hung over everyone's head, shimmering silently, its fall inevitable, but its timing unknown. You went to work, you bought your groceries, you listened to the radio, all while knowing that at any moment, the silence could shatter. It was like living in a house where the plumbing makes a strange gurgling sound every now and then, and you just know it's going to burst, but you have no idea when, or where, or how much water damage it'll cause. Historians still debate whether this period of quietude was a strategic miscalculation by the Allies, a missed opportunity to strike before Germany fully mobilized, or if it was an inevitable consequence of the military doctrines and defensive postures prevalent at the time. Was it a genuine pause for Hitler to consolidate gains in Poland and prepare for his next move, or was it a clever feint designed to lull the Allies into a false sense of security? The quiet gave rise to 1,000 theories, whispered in hushed tones in pubs and living rooms across Europe. One quirky tidbit from this time highlights the sheer oddity of it all. British soldiers, many of whom had never left their hometowns, found themselves stationed in France, often with very little to do. They were issued French phrasebooks, which, while practical, probably felt a bit ridiculous when the most pressing linguistic challenge was asking for a cup of tea, not coordinating a frontal assault. Morale-boosting efforts included things like encouraging pen-pal relationships with French civilians and organizing sports events, which felt more like a summer camp than a prelude to the deadliest conflict in human history. The intelligence reports coming back from the front lines during this time must have been thrilling. Enemy activity, minimal. Observed, one German soldier attempting to teach a squirrel to fetch. This unsettling stillness wasn't just a lack of action, it was an active absence of the expected. It forced nations to ponder their very definition of war. Was war only defined by the sound of gunfire and the movement of troops, or could it be a silent, psychological siege? The answers, of course, would come, but not yet. For now, Europe remained wrapped in a cloak of profound quiet, a continent holding its breath, listening intently for the first true whisper of the storm. As that strange, unsettling stillness settled over the battlefields of Western Europe, a different kind of quiet, yet equally profound, transformation began on the home fronts. While the soldiers sat in their trenches, polishing their boots and wondering if anyone had remembered to pack the biscuits, civilians across Europe were quietly, determinately, adapting to a wartime existence, preparing for a fight that had, quite stubbornly, yet to begin. Imagine yourself in a bustling city like London or Paris in the autumn of 1939. The declarations of war had been made, the newspapers screamed headlines of conflict, and the air was thick with a nervous anticipation. Yet, the expected bombs didn't fall. The air raid sirens, installed with such urgency, mostly remained silent, like sleeping mechanical beasts. But despite this peculiar calm, life was undeniably shifting. You could feel it in the air, a subtle tightening, a collective bracing for impact. It was like waiting for a really big, dramatic sneeze that just never quite comes, leaving you perpetually poised, nostrils twitching. One of the most immediate and visible changes was the implementation of the blackouts. As dusk fell, you'd find yourself navigating streets plunged into an unfamiliar, almost theatrical darkness. Every window, every doorway, had to be carefully masked to prevent any sliver of light from escaping, lest it guide enemy bombers that, for now, were conspicuous by their absence. You'd learn to trust your feet more than your eyes, shuffling along pavements, perhaps bumping into a lamppost you hadn't realized was there, or tripping over an errant curb. It was a strange new normal, a nightly descent into a world of muted sounds and unseen obstacles, making you wonder if the local council had suddenly decided to implement a city-wide, extreme hide-and-seek championship. You became remarkably adept at sensing your surroundings, a sort of urban bat navigating by echolocation, or perhaps just by a very strong sense of impending shin injury. Then there were the evacuations. Almost immediately after the declaration of war, millions of children in Britain, along with pregnant women and some disabled adults, were moved from urban centers to the perceived safety of the countryside. Imagine the scene: train stations filled with bewildered children, clutching gas mask boxes and small suitcases, saying tearful goodbyes to parents who didn't know when, or if, they would see them again. It was a massive logistical undertaking, a mainstream historical fact of the Phoney War, designed to protect the most vulnerable from the anticipated aerial onslaught. Yet, for many of these evacuees, the war remained a distant, abstract concept, a strange new home in a quiet village, far from the sounds of battle that never came. It was a preemptive strike against a ghost, a heartfelt effort to save lives from a danger that hadn't materialized. This period was a masterclass in preparing for the unknown. People were encouraged to dig air raid shelters in their gardens, or to reinforce their cellars. Posters appeared everywhere with stern, reassuring messages about careless talk costs lives and dig for victory. You might find yourself queuing for a ration book, even though initial rationing was light, the very existence of the book a tangible reminder of the scarcity to come. There was a quiet determination, a sense of collective purpose, but it was tinged with an undeniable sense of the absurd. You were asked to prepare for the worst, but the worst seemed to be taking an unusually long coffee break. The psychological toll of this waiting, this limbo, was subtle but pervasive. You woke up each morning, half expecting to hear the news of a major offensive, only to find the headlines were still focused on diplomatic maneuvers, or perhaps, a new recipe for using up old bread. There was an underlying hum of anxiety, a constant state of readiness that never quite transitioned into action. It was like living in a perpetual state of standby mode, consuming energy without ever fully engaging. This peculiar tension often led to a heightened sense of community, a quiet camaraderie born of shared uncertainty. People leaned on their neighbors, swapped rumors, and tried to make sense of a war that wasn't behaving like a war. Governments, too, had to adapt their messaging. With no grand victories to celebrate or desperate battles to recount, propaganda during the Phoney War shifted. Instead of fiery calls to arms, you'd see posters emphasizing resilience, self-sufficiency, and vigilance. It was about quietly reinforcing morale, maintaining a steady nerve, and encouraging people to do their bit, even if their bit mostly involved making sure their blackout curtains were properly drawn. It was a bit like a motivational speaker trying to inspire an audience for a marathon that might, or might not, start next year. This wasn't just about turning off lights, it was about covering them. Special thick curtains, known as blackout curtains, were installed, or you might have used blankets, cardboard, anything to prevent even a pinprick of light from escaping. The idea, of course, was to make it impossible for enemy bombers to find their targets. The irony during the Phoney War was that there were barely any enemy bombers to find targets. So you meticulously covered your windows each evening, then stumbled around your own home, stubbing your toe on furniture you'd owned for years, all in preparation for an attack that simply wasn't coming. It was a bit like putting on full riot gear just to pick up your dry cleaning. Then there were the evacuations. In the days leading up to the declaration of war, a monumental undertaking known as Operation Pied Piper unfolded. Over the course of just 3 days in early September, approximately 1.5 million people, predominantly children, but also mothers with infants, pregnant women, and disabled individuals, were moved from urban centers, deemed high-risk bombing targets, to the relative safety of the countryside. Imagine the scene: train stations bustling with anxious parents and bewildered children, clutching gas mask boxes and small suitcases, pinned with labels indicating their destination. You might have seen your own neighbor's children, or perhaps your own, waving goodbye from a carriage window, heading off to live with strangers in rural villages. This was a mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped the early war experience for millions. The children, arriving in quaint villages where they'd never set foot, were billeted with host families. For some, it was a wonderful adventure, a chance to experience farm life or the quietude of the countryside. For others, it was lonely, disorienting, and sometimes deeply unhappy. And then, as the weeks turned into months and the bombs failed to drop, many of them started to drift back home. The urgency faded. Parents missed their children, and the children missed their parents. The government had anticipated this, but the scale of the return was still surprising. By January 1940, it's estimated that nearly half of the evacuated children had returned to their homes in the cities. It was a bit like planning a massive nationwide sleepover, only for half the guests to get homesick before the pizza even arrived. Despite these dramatic shifts, the sudden plunge into darkness each night, the exodus of children, life in Britain maintained a strange sense of ordinary routine. You still went to work. Shops still opened, though some goods became scarcer or rationed. Schools, after the initial disruption of evacuations, largely reopened, often adapting to new realities like air raid drills. People still went to the cinema, though screenings might be interrupted by an air raid siren, which, during the Phoney War, usually meant nothing was actually happening. You might queue for a bus, read the newspaper, complain about the weather, or gossip about your neighbors, just as you always had. The newspapers, while filled with war news, also carried sports results, fashion tips, and advertisements for everyday items. There was an almost defiant insistence on carrying on, a quiet refusal to let the absence of war completely derail the rhythms of existence. Think of it. You're told to prepare for the apocalypse, so you build a bunker, stock up on supplies, and then nothing. For months. Do you stay in the bunker? Or do you eventually come out, water your garden, and just keep one eye on the sky? Britain chose the latter. People were encouraged to dig for victory, growing their own food in allotments and gardens, but the immediate impetus for this was more about long-term resource management than urgent wartime necessity. You might have seen posters urging you to save scraps for pigs or reminding you that careless talk costs lives, but the lives weren't actually being lost on British streets. A quirky tidbit from this period, demonstrating the unique blend of seriousness and absurdity, was the instruction given to pet owners regarding blackouts. If you were taking your dog for a walk after dark, you were advised to attach a reflective collar or lead, or even to paint your pet with luminous paint, so they wouldn't disappear into the gloom and become a tripping hazard. Imagine trying to get Rover to sit still while you slathered him in glow-in-the-dark goo. Also, he didn't become a casualty of an unseen curb rather than an unseen bomber. It speaks to a very British, very practical, and slightly bemused approach to unprecedented circumstances. The psychological impact of this waiting game was profound. On one hand, there was a collective sigh of relief that the expected devastation hadn't materialized. On the other, a creeping unease began to set in. How long could this last? Was this the calm before the storm, or was it just this? Historians still debate the extent to which the prolonged inactivity of the Phoney War affected public morale and preparedness for the intense bombing campaigns that would eventually come. Did it breed complacency, or did it allow the nation to slowly, deliberately, and with characteristic British stoicism, adapt to a new reality? You'd hear the occasional air raid siren, a mournful wail cutting through the night, but more often than not, it would be followed by the all-clear signal without a single bomb dropping. You might grumble about the inconvenience, the interruption to your sleep, but there was a growing sense of cynicism, a feeling that these were more drills than warnings. The gas masks, issued to every man, woman, and child, were carried everywhere in their cardboard boxes, a constant, slightly cumbersome reminder of the war. But how many times did you actually put it on, except perhaps to try it on for size or to amuse the children? It became an accessory, like a particularly ugly handbag you were legally obliged to carry. So while the declarations of war had been made, and the machinery of conflict had begun to grind, on the home front in Britain, life settled into an odd rhythm. It was a period of anticipation without action, of preparation without engagement. You learned to live with the paradox of being at war, yet experiencing peace. You adapted to the blackouts, the occasional absence of children, and the constant, low hum of uncertainty, all while trying your best to maintain tea time, cue politely, and complain about the weather, just as you always had. It was, in its own way, a testament to resilience, or perhaps, simply, a monumental act of collective procrastination. As you drift through the quiet corridors of this strange historical moment, your gaze now turns eastward, across the Rhine, to the vast, complex machinery of Germany. Here, the stillness wasn't born of uncertainty or a hesitant pause, but rather a deliberate, calculated quietude. Imagine yourself standing on a crisp, cold November morning in 1939, perhaps on the outskirts of Berlin, feeling the chill wind whip around you. There's no immediate sound of distant artillery, no urgent sirens tearing through the air. Instead, you hear the muffled thrum of industry, the distant clang of metal on metal from factories working overtime, and perhaps the low murmur of soldiers' voices as they go about their rigorous training. This wasn't a nation caught off guard. It was a nation regrouping, refining, and preparing for the next, much larger act in a drama it had meticulously scripted. After the swift, brutal campaign that had swept through Poland in mere weeks, the German war machine, while victorious, wasn't immediately ready for another massive undertaking. Think of it like a chef who's just pulled off an incredible, complex dish, but now needs to clean the kitchen, resupply the pantry, and sharpen all their knives before tackling the next, even more ambitious culinary masterpiece. The troops needed rest, equipment needed maintenance and replacement, and perhaps most crucially, the strategic minds in the German high command needed time to digest the lessons learned from Poland and apply them to the far more formidable challenge of facing the combined forces of France and Britain. This period of quiet was, for Germany, a strategic breathing space, a gift from the seemingly passive Western allies. During this lull, the figure at the very center of Germany's plans, Adolf Hitler, was anything but quiet in his own mind. His impatience, a trait as legendary as his ambition, was constantly chafing at the perceived delays. He was already fixated on the next grand objective, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. This was not a whim. It was the cornerstone of his vision for German dominance in Europe. He saw the defeat of France as essential to securing Germany's western flank before turning his gaze eastward once more. You can almost hear the endless, insistent demands echoing through the marble halls of the Reich Chancellery as Hitler pressed his generals to accelerate their preparations, to be ready yesterday. It was a bit like trying to rush a meticulously planned wedding, where every detail, from the floral arrangements to the seating chart, needs to be perfect, but the impatient groom keeps asking, "Are we there yet?" This was the mainstream historical fact of the period. Hitler was actively pushing for the invasion of the West, known as Fall Gelb, case yellow, repeatedly setting and then postponing invasion dates due to adverse weather conditions, logistical bottlenecks, and the lingering, if often overruled, caution of his generals. He had initially wanted to launch the offensive in the autumn of 1939, right after Poland, but the realities of military logistics and the onset of winter made such an immediate move impractical. So the quietude wasn't a choice for not fighting, but a pragmatic necessity for how and when to fight. This time was used to integrate new units, train soldiers in the specific tactics required for the Western Front's terrain, and ensure the vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies were in place for an offensive that would dwarf the Polish campaign in scale and complexity. While the world outside saw a quiet Germany, within its borders, the internal machinery was humming, albeit with a controlled hum. The German military was busy refining its revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics, the lightning war strategy that had stunned the world in Poland. This wasn't just about tanks rolling fast. It was about the intricate coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support, all working in concert to punch through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs. The Phoney War gave them invaluable time to analyze what worked and what didn't in Poland, to iron out kinks in their command and control, and to train their forces for the more challenging terrain and more formidable opposition they would face in the West. Imagine a highly skilled orchestra, having just performed a successful concert, now spending months in intense rehearsals, perfecting every note, every crescendo, every subtle nuance, knowing their next performance is for an even larger, more critical audience. One quirky tidbit from this period revolves around the internal debates and even the skepticism within the German high command itself. While Hitler was fixated on the rapid invasion of France, Many of his senior generals, including figures like General Franz Halder, the chief of the general staff, harbored significant reservations. They worried about the strength of the Maginot Line, the professionalism of the French army, and the logistical nightmare of a winter offensive. There were even whispers of plots to remove Hitler if he insisted on an immediate, ill-prepared attack. This internal dissent, though ultimately suppressed or ignored, meant that the quietude wasn't just about external calm. It also reflected a period of intense internal struggle and consolidation of power, as Hitler worked to bring his military leadership fully in line with his aggressive vision. It's like a corporate board meeting where the CEO is pushing for an incredibly risky new product launch, and the entire executive team is quietly, nervously, trying to find polite ways to say, "Are you sure about this, boss? We haven't even finished the market research." The Western Allies, meanwhile, largely played into Germany's hands by remaining passive. They were building up their own forces, certainly, but they weren't launching any significant offensive operations that would have forced Germany to divert resources or accelerate its plans prematurely. This allowed Germany to concentrate its resources and attention almost entirely on the Western Front, without the distraction of a major two-front war. You can almost see the satisfaction on the faces of the German strategists, watching the French and British dig in, waiting for a frontal assault that wasn't coming, while Germany was busy preparing a very different kind of surprise. It was akin to two boxers in a ring, one dancing around, feinting, while the other just stands in the corner, flexing, waiting for the bell to ring for the next round. This strategic quietude wasn't without its psychological toll on the German soldiers. Having just experienced the rapid, decisive victory in Poland, many expected an immediate follow-up. Instead, they found themselves in a holding pattern, training, waiting, and wondering when the real war would begin. This Sitzkrieg, or sitting war, as it was also known in Germany, created a strange sense of anticlimax. Soldiers practiced maneuvers, maintained equipment, and endured the harsh winter, all while the tension slowly built, like a tightly wound spring. Imagine being on a roller coaster. You've just been through one exhilarating drop, and now you're slowly clicking your way up an even higher, longer ascent, the anticipation building with every mechanical clunk. Historians still quietly ponder whether the delay truly allowed Germany to perfect its blitzkrieg tactics, or simply gave Hitler the political space to consolidate his command and silence dissenting voices within the Wehrmacht who favored a less aggressive, more defensive posture in the West. It's a nuanced question, because while the extra months certainly allowed for logistical improvements and further training, the core tactical concepts were already well established. Perhaps the greatest benefit was the psychological one. It allowed Hitler to reinforce his image as a decisive leader who knew when to strike and when to wait. It also allowed the German war economy to shift more fully into a total war footing, quietly ramping up production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions that would be vital for the coming offensive. So, as you step back from this scene of strategic quietude, you realize that Germany's silence wasn't emptiness, but a carefully controlled environment of intense preparation. It was the calm before a storm, yes, but a storm meticulously planned, its lightning bolts aimed with chilling precision. The Western Allies' passivity inadvertently provided the perfect conditions for Germany to transform its recent battlefield successes into a refined, formidable instrument of war, poised to strike when the weather cleared and the time was deemed ripe. While the land fronts seemed to hold their breath, you find that the vast, swirling expanse of the oceans tells a slightly different story. Here, beneath the tranquil surface, the war wasn't entirely phony. It was merely a whisper, a series of distant, muffled thuds echoing across the waves. The sea, you see, became a subtle battlefield, a vast, watery chessboard where pieces moved with a quiet, deadly purpose, largely unseen by the anxious eyes on shore. It was here that the first true skirmishes of the war unfolded, a constant, low-level hum of conflict that reminded everyone that while the armies were waiting, the navies were most certainly not. Imagine yourself, if you will, huddled on the bridge of a merchant ship, a tiny speck of humanity braving the immense, indifferent Atlantic. The air is thick with the scent of salt and diesel, the rhythmic thrum of the engines a constant companion. Your cargo holds are laden with vital supplies, food, fuel, raw materials, the lifeblood of a nation at war, even one that hadn't quite started fighting yet. You're part of a convoy, a scattered flock of vessels moving in uneasy unison, each captain's eyes scanning the horizon, not for enemy ships, but for something far more insidious, the telltale wake of a periscope, the sudden, violent eruption of a torpedo. These early days of the Phoney War saw the German U-boat fleet, though still relatively small, begin its campaign against Allied shipping. It was a terrifying, unseen enemy, lurking in the depths, striking with chilling precision before vanishing back into the watery abyss. The very first casualty of the war, you might recall, wasn't a soldier on a battlefield, but a civilian on a passenger liner. Just hours after Britain declared war, the SS Athenia, a passenger ship carrying over 1,000 people, including many Americans, was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. This tragic incident, a stark and immediate reminder of the war's brutal reality, sent ripples of shock across the globe. It was a clear signal that the rules of engagement, however unwritten, were already being stretched, and that the war at sea would be anything but quiet. For the sailors and merchant mariners, life became a tense, perpetual game of hide-and-seek, where the stakes were always life or death. You can almost feel the cold dread that would settle in your stomach as you listened to the hydrophones, straining to pick up the distant, metallic clang of a submarine's props, or the unnerving silence that preceded an attack. Life aboard those early U-boats, conversely, was a study in extreme discomfort and claustrophobia. Picture yourself crammed into a steel tube, the air thick with the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies, sharing what little personal space there was with torpedoes, machinery, and dozens of your closest comrades. Imagine being stuck in a metal tube with 50 other people, relying on recycled air and hoping no one forgot to pack the good instant coffee. Talk about an office team-building exercise gone wrong, only with far higher stakes. The silence during a deep dive, broken only by the creak of the hull and the soft hiss of compressed air, would have been deafening in its intensity, every man acutely aware of the crushing pressure of the ocean outside. These were not the grand, glorious battles of dreadnoughts, but a silent, nerve-wracking war of attrition, played out in the dark, cold depths. Beyond the U-boat menace, other shadowy figures prowled the open seas. German surface raiders, disguised merchant ships or swift pocket battleships, slipped through the Allied blockade to hunt down unsuspecting merchant vessels. These were often cat-and-mouse chases across vast stretches of ocean, culminating in tense standoffs or desperate, one-sided battles. One of the most famous and decisive naval engagements of this entire period, a mainstream historical fact that punctuates the quietude, was the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939. Here, off the coast of Uruguay, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, a formidable commerce raider that had sunk several Allied merchant ships, was cornered by 3 Royal Navy cruisers, HMS Ajax, HMS Achilles, and HMS Exeter. You can almost visualize the scene, the vast, empty ocean, suddenly alive with the flash of gun barrels and the roar of naval artillery. The Graf Spee, outgunned individually but superior in armor and range to its pursuers, fought a desperate battle. The British ships, though smaller, pressed their attack with relentless courage, taking significant damage, but inflicting enough of their own to force the Graf Spee to seek refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo. The ensuing diplomatic standoff, a tense dance between international law and strategic necessity, gripped the world's attention. Ultimately, rather than face what he believed to be overwhelming odds upon leaving port, the Graf Spee's captain Hans Langsdorff chose to scuttle his ship, sinking her in the shallow waters of the estuary. It was a dramatic ending to a thrilling chase, a rare moment of overt naval combat in a period defined by its lack. The sea, too, was a canvas for ingenious, if sometimes quirky, new forms of warfare. The Germans, for instance, began deploying magnetic mines, dropped from aircraft or laid by U-boats, which detonated not on impact, but when a ship's magnetic field triggered them. This presented a terrifying new threat, and the scramble to develop countermeasures led to the rapid development of degaussing technology, essentially wrapping ships in electrical cables to neutralize their magnetic signature. Imagine the frantic efforts, the scientists and engineers working round the clock, trying to figure out how to make a giant metal boat invisible to a magnetic bomb. It must have felt a bit like trying to teach a whale to tiptoe, a peculiar challenge, to say the least. These silent, unseen weapons transformed vast swathes of ocean into treacherous minefields, adding another layer of quiet danger to the maritime war. But it wasn't just about direct conflict. The Phoney War at sea was also about control, about strangulation. Both sides attempted to impose blockades, albeit with varying degrees of success. The British Royal Navy, with its vast network of ships and bases, sought to cut off Germany's access to vital raw materials, while German U-boats and raiders aimed to starve Britain of its imports. It was a strategic arm wrestling match, played out over thousands of miles of ocean, with each side trying to tighten the noose around the other's economic throat. You could almost hear the quiet hum of the engines of countless freighters, desperately trying to slip through the net, or the distant, almost imperceptible ping of sonar, searching for an unseen foe. Even the air above the oceans played a role, though a limited one. Reconnaissance flights would crisscross the shipping lanes, searching for enemy vessels or spotting U-boats on the surface. These weren't the dogfights and bombing raids that would come later, but quiet, methodical surveys, a lonely pilot peering down through the clouds, hoping to spot a telltale ripple in the water or the silhouette of a distant ship. Trying to find a single U-boat in the Atlantic back then was a bit like trying to find your car keys after you've tidied up. Theoretically possible, but often a monumental task, requiring endless patience and a good pair of binoculars. Historians still argue whether the early U-boat campaigns truly achieved their intended strategic disruption, or if they merely served as a costly, if unsettling, prelude to future, more intense naval warfare. What is clear, however, is that while the land armies remained largely static, the sailors and merchant mariners of the world were already engaged in a grim, relentless struggle. Their battles were often solitary, fought against the vastness of the sea as much as against the enemy, punctuated by moments of sheer terror and quiet heroism. The sea, therefore, during this period of calm, was far from peaceful. It was a constant, churning reminder that beneath the surface of the Phoney War, the currents of conflict were indeed flowing, silently, inexorably, towards a more turbulent future. Sending a message across the Atlantic was less instant message, and more send a carrier pigeon, and hope it doesn't get distracted by a particularly interesting cloud formation, adding to the isolated nature of these oceanic encounters. And so, as autumn's crisp air yielded to something far more biting, you find yourself trudging, not through battlefields, but through increasingly heavy snowdrifts. The quiet declarations of war, the unsettling stillness, the life on waiting home fronts, all of it now blanketed by a new, formidable, and entirely natural opponent, the bitter cold of the 1939-40 winter. This wasn't just a nippy spell, it was, for many, one of the harshest winters in living memory, a truly bone-chilling affair that seemed to conspire with the strategic lull, further deepening the sense of gentle emptiness that pervaded Western Europe. Imagine, if you will, the wind howling not with the distant shriek of artillery shells, but with a mournful, icy wail that rattles window panes and seeps through the thickest military greatcoats. The ground, once merely damp or muddy, became an unyielding, frozen expanse, a vast, white canvas upon which no grand offensives were being painted. Rivers that had flowed with quiet purpose now stood locked in glassy stillness, their surfaces thick enough to bear the weight of a curious soldier, or perhaps a particularly bored supply truck, if anyone dared. It was a winter so severe that even the most seasoned farmers, the kind who measure their lives in seasons and harvests, would later recall it with a shudder, often muttering about frozen pipes and unprecedented fuel shortages. This wasn't just a cold front, it was a climatic siege, a natural force that seemed to enforce the very inactivity that the Phoney War had already established. For the soldiers, whether nestled deep within the concrete embrace of the Maginot Line, or shivering in makeshift billets behind the Siegfried Line, the daily routine became a quiet battle against the elements. You might picture them, huddled around sputtering, inefficient stoves, their breath fogging in the frigid air, hands perpetually numb despite layers of wool. Their greatest enemy wasn't an unseen foe across the border, but the insidious chill that crept into their bones, the constant threat of frostbite, and the sheer, mind-numbing boredom that winter amplified. What do you do when the war you're supposed to be fighting is colder than a polar bear's picnic and about as active? You learn to play cards with frozen fingers, you invent new ways to brew tea in an unheated room, and you dream of spring with a fervent intensity, usually reserved for actual combat leave. Even the most mundane tasks took on Herculean proportions. Maintaining equipment in sub-zero temperatures became a nightmare of frozen grease and stiff mechanisms. Vehicles, if they started at all, protested with groans and wheezes, their engines reluctant to stir from their icy slumber. Patrols, already a quiet affair, became an exercise in endurance, each crunch of snow underfoot echoing in the vast silence, reminding you just how exposed you were, not to enemy fire, but to the relentless, biting wind. It was less about strategic maneuvering and more about simply staying warm, a kind of internal war against chattering teeth and numb extremities. One might even joke that the biggest tactical victory of the winter was successfully getting a stubborn fire started in the morning. On the home fronts, too, the cold added another layer of quiet discomfort to the already strange wartime normalcy. Blackouts, which had been implemented to prevent enemy bombers from finding targets, now plunged communities into an even deeper, more profound darkness, made only more oppressive by the biting cold outside. You'd pull your curtains tight, not just against hypothetical air raids, but against the visible breath of the winter night. Fuel was rationed, of course, and you learned to cherish every lump of coal, every log, every flicker of warmth. Queues for basic necessities, already a feature of wartime life, now involved stamping feet and red noses, the collective sigh of resignation mingling with the visible vapor of their breath. It was a peculiar kind of shared hardship, where everyone was united in their struggle against the cold, rather than against a common human enemy. Perhaps the most common complaint wasn't about the lack of butter, but the sheer impossibility of keeping your toes warm. This pervasive cold, this gentle emptiness of winter, truly mirrored the strategic inactivity of the Phoney War. Just as the landscape was locked in a frozen embrace, so too were the vast armies of Europe. Operations that might have been planned were postponed, supply lines became treacherous, and the very thought of launching a major offensive seemed utterly absurd when simply moving a division a few miles became a logistical nightmare. Historians still argue whether the severity of the 1939-40 winter was a primary cause for the extended lull on the Western Front, or merely a convenient, natural justification for an inactivity that was already strategically preferred by both sides. Was it the weather that truly halted the war, or did it just provide the perfect excuse for leaders who were still planning their next moves? Or perhaps, simply hoping that something would change without them having to commit to a bloodbath? One quirky tidbit from this period underscores the quiet absurdity. With so little actual fighting, some soldiers on the Maginot Line, bored out of their minds and desperate for something to do, reportedly engaged in a strange form of competitive gardening. They would cultivate small plots of vegetables or flowers within the relative warmth of their bunkers, sometimes even exchanging seeds with units further down the line, as if preparing for a particularly competitive village fate rather than a global conflict. It was a quiet act of defiance against the overwhelming boredom, a small, green spark of life in a world otherwise frozen in strategic inaction. Imagine the bragging rights. My carrots are bigger than yours, even though we're both waiting for a war that isn't happening. The mainstream historical fact here is the sheer intensity of the winter itself. The winter of 1939-40 was indeed exceptionally severe across much of Europe, with temperatures plummeting to record lows and heavy snowfall, disrupting transportation and daily life. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a significant environmental factor that undeniably complicated any military planning and contributed to the prevailing sense of strategic stagnation. It was as if nature itself had decided to press the pause button on human conflict, imposing its own, far more ancient and powerful form of quietude. So, as you drift deeper into this historical lull, you can almost feel the chill in the air, the crispness of the snow underfoot, and the profound silence that only a truly deep winter can bring. It was a time when the world held its breath, and nature seemed to hold it too, freezing the conflict in a state of suspended animation. The bitter cold of the 1939-40 winter didn't just deepen the lull, it transformed it, giving the Phoney War a stark, beautiful, and utterly empty landscape to call its own. And so, as the chill of winter deepened its embrace across Europe, you might imagine the skies above would roar with the fury of battle. But instead, a peculiar hush settled, not just on the land, but high above it, where birds usually soared and now occasionally planes. Think of it like a really long, really quiet episode of a nature documentary, but instead of majestic eagles, you're watching very expensive, very shiny metal birds, mostly just observing. You're up there, in the cockpit, the hum of the engine a constant, low thrum against the vast, empty canvas of the sky. It's cold, even with your thick flight suit, the kind of cold that seems to seep into your bones, making you wonder if your breath will freeze mid-air. You peer down through the plexiglass, the world below a blurred, frozen tapestry of fields and forests, occasionally punctuated by the tiny toy-like structures of towns. This isn't the dogfighting drama you've seen in the newsreels, the kind that makes your heart pound. No, this is more like a very high-stakes game of I Spy, where the stakes are, theoretically, global domination, but the actual activity is, well, mostly just looking. The air, for the most part, was a realm of limited skirmishes, a space where the grand, destructive ballet of war was still rehearsing, very quietly behind closed doors. What few aerial encounters did occur were less about fiery explosions and more about a quiet, almost polite, dance of observation. You might be flying your reconnaissance mission, tracing a careful, predetermined path, when suddenly, a speck appears on the horizon. It grows, resolves itself into the unmistakable silhouette of an enemy plane. Your heart gives a little flutter, a primal instinct kicking in. But then nothing. They fly past, perhaps a wingtip dip, a moment of shared, silent acknowledgement, before each goes on its way. It's like two commuters on a very long, very empty highway, briefly making eye contact before returning to their own thoughts. You think, oh, so that's what the enemy looks like. Not so scary from up here, just another person trying to do their job, probably also bored stiff. You might even wonder if they had their own version of a sleepy ASMR podcast playing in their cockpit, maybe something about the history of clouds. This period saw the skies primarily used for reconnaissance flights. Both the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the Luftwaffe were sending their planes up, not to drop bombs, but to gather intelligence. Imagine being a pilot, day after day, flying over enemy territory, your primary weapon a camera. You're looking for troop movements, fortifications, industrial sites, anything that might give your side an edge when the actual fighting started. It's a bit like being a private detective, but your office is 20,000 feet up, and your clients are entire nations. You might spend hours meticulously charting railway lines, or counting the number of trucks in a distant convoy. The thrill of flight is still there, of course, the sheer wonder of being above it all, the world spread out beneath you like a giant, wrinkled map. But the adrenaline rush of combat? That was largely absent. It was a war of potential, a silent promise of future destruction, rather than present chaos. A mainstream historical fact from this quiet period in the skies is the sheer prevalence of leaflet raids. Instead of high-explosive bombs, British bombers, particularly early in the war, were often loaded with millions of propaganda leaflets, which they then dropped over German cities. Imagine that, flying a massive, expensive bomber, risking your life, just to litter someone else's lawn with paper. These weren't exactly fiery calls to revolution either. They were often rather polite, explaining Britain's reasons for going to war, or urging the German people to see the light. You can almost hear the pilots grumbling, all this training, all this technology just to deliver junk mail. It was a bizarre, almost comical form of psychological warfare, more akin to a very aggressive paperboy than a combat mission. One can only imagine the German citizens finding these soggy pamphlets in their gardens, perhaps using them to light their stoves, or for a very uncomfortable trip to the outhouse. Well, at least it's good for something, you might hear them mutter, wiping their brow. There's a quirky tidbit from this time that further emphasizes the surreal nature of the aerial Phoney War. There were documented instances of pilots from opposing sides actually waving at each other as they passed during reconnaissance missions. No shots fired, no aggressive maneuvers, just a brief, almost friendly, acknowledgement of each other's presence in the vast emptiness of the sky. It speaks to the strange, almost gentlemanly, nature of this early phase of the conflict. You're flying your Spitfire, he's flying his Messerschmitt, both of you probably bored, cold, and a little bit anxious about what tomorrow might bring. For a fleeting moment, you're not enemies, just two highly skilled professionals in highly specialized machines, sharing the same lonely sky. It's the kind of moment that makes you pause and wonder about the human element, even in the midst of declared hostilities. Like two rival sports teams warming up before the big game, nodding to each other before the whistle blows. This period of aerial inaction was a strategic enigma. For the Allies, particularly Britain and France, there was a reluctance to initiate large-scale air attacks on Germany. Part of this was fear of retaliation. If they bombed German cities, what would stop the Luftwaffe from retaliating in kind against London or Paris? There was also a strong belief in the effectiveness of the Maginot Line, a defensive mindset that prioritized holding ground rather than aggressive offense. On the German side, Hitler was focused on consolidating his gains in Poland and refining his plans for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. He certainly didn't want to provoke the Western Allies into a full-scale air war before he was ready. So the skies remained largely quiet, a vast, empty stage waiting for its actors to arrive. Historians still argue whether the Allies' passive aerial strategy during the Phoney War was a missed opportunity to cripple German war production or a prudent decision to conserve resources and avoid unnecessary escalation. Some scholars contend that if the RAF and French Air Force had launched aggressive bombing campaigns against German industrial targets early on, it might have significantly hampered the Nazi war machine. Others argue that their air forces were not yet fully prepared for such an offensive, and that a premature attack would have led to heavy losses without significant strategic gains. It's a debate that echoes through the annals of military strategy, a what-if that continues to fascinate. Was it caution, unpreparedness, or a deliberate, if ultimately flawed, strategy? You can almost hear the drone of their academic arguments, a different kind of quiet hum. So you continue your patrol, the engine a steady companion, the world below a silent diorama. The peaceful reconnaissance missions were a daily reminder that this was a war, yes, but one that hadn't quite decided to fully engage. You'd check your instruments, make your log entries, and scan the horizon, more out of habit than expectation. The vastness of the sky was a perfect mirror for the strategic void below, a place of immense potential, yet filled with an unsettling emptiness. You're a pilot in a war that isn't really happening, flying over an enemy that isn't really fighting, all while preparing for a storm that everyone knows is coming, but no one can quite predict when. It's a strange, almost surreal existence, punctuated only by the occasional flutter of a dropped leaflet, or the distant, almost friendly, wave from another lonely soul in a parallel universe, high above the quiet, waiting world. You find yourself drifting now, away from the watchful silence of the Maginot Line and the quiet hum of British homefronts, into a realm even more hushed, more tentative, the world of diplomacy during the Phoney War. Imagine, if you will, the elegant, wood-paneled rooms of embassies and chanceries across Europe, usually bustling with the urgent whispers of international intrigue. During this peculiar period, they weren't empty, no, but they were filled with a different kind of quietude, a softer, almost regretful kind of activity. It was here, in these gilded cages of negotiation, that diplomacy attempted its gentle, unheeded efforts. Think of it like trying to persuade a particularly stubborn houseplant to bloom in the middle of winter. You might offer it the perfect light, the right amount of water, perhaps even a tiny, encouraging pep talk, but deep down, you know its dormant nature is simply not ready to be stirred. That's precisely the atmospheric pressure within which these peace proposals quietly surfaced. They weren't grand, public pronouncements meant to shock and awe. Instead, they were more like delicate tendrils, reaching out from neutral capitals, from the Vatican, from the distant shores of America, testing the air for any sign of a thaw. You can almost hear the rustle of official telegrams, the soft click of fountain pens on heavy parchment, the clinking of teacups in hushed drawing rooms where well-meaning envoys met over hushed conversations. These weren't the dramatic, table-pounding negotiations you might envision from a Hollywood movie about war. Oh no, this was the polite, almost apologetic dance of diplomats who, on some level, knew they were trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube after it had already been squeezed out. It was a war, after all, that had been declared, even if it hadn't fully erupted. Trying to negotiate peace at this point felt a bit like trying to return a perfectly good, albeit slightly used, item to a store without a receipt. Possible, perhaps, but certainly an uphill battle. One of the most prominent, and perhaps most poignant, of these gentle overtures came from the Vatican. Pope Pius XII, a man known for his deep concern for humanity and his diplomatic experience, made earnest appeals for peace. Imagine the Holy See, nestled in its tiny, independent state, becoming a quiet beacon of hope. Throughout the autumn of 1939 and into the early winter of 1940, the Pope tirelessly worked behind the scenes, using his unique moral authority and extensive diplomatic network to explore any avenue for de-escalation. He dispatched quiet envoys, sent discreet messages to the belligerent powers, urging them to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. His appeals were often framed as pleas for Christian charity and a return to reason, delivered with the gentle urgency of a concerned spiritual leader. You can picture him, late at night, in the quiet solitude of his study, agonizing over the fate of Europe, dictating messages that carried the weight of millennia of spiritual guidance, yet somehow felt as light as a feather against the grim reality of the political landscape. But it wasn't just the Holy Father making these quiet pleas. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, ever the pragmatist, was also sending out feelers, though America's official neutrality meant his efforts were necessarily more cautious, more exploratory. You see him, perhaps, leaning back in his chair in the Oval Office, a cigarette holder held just so, dictating a memo to a trusted aide about a discreet message to be passed through a neutral ambassador. These weren't formal peace conferences. They were more like a series of soft nudges, an attempt to gauge if any of the major players were genuinely open to a negotiated settlement, or if they were merely posturing. And then there were the neutral nations themselves, trying to carve out a role as honest brokers. Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium. Their diplomats were busy, not with grand alliances, but with quiet shuttling between capitals, carrying messages, interpreting nuances, always hoping to find a crack in the hardened resolve of the warring parties. It must have been an exhausting, almost Sisyphean task. You're constantly knocking on doors, offering olive branches, only to find that the doors are politely but firmly shut, or that the olive branches are accepted with a noncommittal nod, and then quietly placed in a vase where they slowly, sadly wilt. One might wonder, with a gentle smirk, if these diplomatic efforts were less about genuine hope for peace, and more about a sort of international politeness, a we tried our best performance for the historical record. It's like when you offer to help someone move, knowing full well they'll decline, but you offer anyway just to be polite. The gestures were there, the intentions, at least from some quarters, were undoubtedly sincere, but the underlying currents of conflict were simply too strong, too deeply entrenched. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit for you. During this period, there were even whispers of unofficial intermediaries, sometimes even socialites or businessmen with international connections, attempting to broker deals. Imagine a wealthy industrialist, perhaps with a villa in the south of France and connections in Berlin, London, and Paris, thinking he could use his personal network to bridge the chasm. You can picture him hosting discreet dinner parties, the clinking of champagne glasses barely masking the strained silence, as he tries to subtly steer conversations towards common ground or mutual understanding. These were often well-intentioned, amateurish attempts, perhaps fueled by a genuine desire to avert catastrophe or, let's be honest, a touch of vanity and the thrill of being in the thick of things. One can almost hear the exasperated sighs of professional diplomats who had to entertain these civilian peace envoys, knowing full well that their informal efforts were about as effective as trying to stop a charging bull with a strongly worded letter. It was a polite charade, often ending with a shrug and a quiet agreement that the time wasn't right. The problem, of course, was that while these gentle proposals were surfacing, the major powers had already staked their claims. Britain and France were committed to the restoration of Polish sovereignty and the end of German aggression. Hitler, on the other hand, had absolutely no intention of relinquishing his gains or halting his ambitions. His peace offers were, for the most part, thinly veiled demands for the Western Allies to accept his conquests and leave him to his own devices. To him, these diplomatic overtures were simply background noise, a minor distraction from his grand, terrible plans. He saw them not as opportunities for genuine negotiation, but as signs of weakness or, at best, a chance to sow discord among the Allies. This brings us to a fascinating point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether any of these diplomatic overtures, particularly those from neutral parties, ever stood a real chance of altering the course of the war, or if they were always doomed to fail given the ideological chasm and strategic objectives of the belligerents. Was there a hidden path, a secret handshake, a clever turn of phrase that could have derailed the oncoming catastrophe? Or were the wheels of war already turning with such unstoppable momentum that no amount of gentle persuasion, no matter how sincere, could have stopped them? It's a bit like asking if you could have convinced a fast-moving train to change tracks mid-journey just by politely asking the conductor. The answer, sadly, tends to lean towards the latter. The truth is, the very quietness of these diplomatic efforts was part of their futility. They were soft whispers in a world bracing for a roar. There was no public outcry, no mass movement pushing for peace at this stage. Rather, a quiet acceptance that war had been declared, and now it was just a matter of waiting for it to truly begin. The public, having endured the declarations of war, was now settling into the strange paradox of being at war without actually fighting. The idea of peace talks felt almost premature, or perhaps too late. So these gentle diplomatic efforts, though well-intentioned and often tirelessly pursued, ultimately withered on the vine. They were noble attempts to keep the channels of communication open, to explore every last sliver of hope, but they failed to stir the underlying currents of conflict. The deep distrust, the unyielding ambitions, and the sheer momentum of declared war proved too formidable. The clinking of teacups and the rustle of official papers eventually gave way to the quiet hum of preparing for a different kind of sound altogether. The silence of diplomacy in this particular chapter was less a sign of peace and more a testament to the unyielding march of fate. And as the winter deepened, The last faint echoes of these gentle overtures faded, leaving behind only the quiet, expectant chill. You find yourself drifting through the quiet, unsettling interlude of the Phoney War, a period where the loudest battles weren't fought with bullets and bombs, but with carefully chosen words and muted images. Imagine, if you will, the hum of your radio, a comforting, familiar sound in the corner of your living room, or the crisp rustle of a freshly printed newspaper as you unfold it at the breakfast table. This was the true frontline for many during this strange calm, the front of public morale, subtly shaped by governments who understood that a nervous population was as dangerous as any enemy invasion. Instead of the rousing, chest-thumping calls to arms you might expect when a nation declares war, the propaganda of this era was a whisper, a gentle nudge, a reassuring pat on the shoulder. It was less about charge, and more about chill out but be ready. Think of it as the historical equivalent of a very calm, slightly sleepy public service announcement, delivered with the soothing tones of a late-night radio DJ. Your leaders weren't demanding you storm the beaches. They were gently suggesting you knit socks for soldiers, or perhaps plant a few extra potatoes in your garden. In Britain, for instance, the government's approach was remarkably understated. You see posters appear on walls and hoardings, not depicting heroic soldiers bayoneting the enemy, but instead featuring simple, almost mundane instructions. There's one advising you to dig for victory, urging you to transform your lawn into a vegetable patch. You might even chuckle a little at the idea, picturing yourself, trowel in hand, waging war against a particularly stubborn weed, feeling strangely patriotic about it. Another popular campaign gently reminds you that careless talk costs lives, a quiet warning against gossip that might inadvertently aid the enemy. It's a subtle chill down your spine, a reminder that even your casual conversations have consequence, but delivered with the same visual calm as an advertisement for tea. This was a far cry from the jingoistic fervor of World War I, where lurid caricatures and fiery rhetoric were commonplace. This time, the mood was different. The public was weary of grand pronouncements, perhaps a little cynical after the last great conflict. So the messages had to be believable, relatable, and above all calming. You might see a poster depicting a contented family sharing a meal, with a caption about rationing being a shared sacrifice, a quiet act of unity. It wasn't about deprivation, it was about collective fortitude. It was about making you feel like you were part of something important, even if that something important was simply saving your bacon fat for the war effort. Consider the famous, though less widely displayed at the time than later believed, "Keep Calm and Carry On" poster. While many copies languished in storage, ready for a true crisis, its spirit permeated the messaging of the era. You felt it in the radio broadcasts, the newspaper editorials, the public information films. The underlying message was always, maintain your composure, continue with your daily life as much as possible, and trust that the government has things under control. It was a form of psychological defense, a quiet fortification of the national spirit against the creeping anxiety of the unknown. You're not just carrying on, you're carrying on stoically, perhaps even with a slightly stiff upper lip, because that's what's expected of you. On the German side, the propaganda was also carefully calibrated, though with a different underlying objective. While Britain aimed for quiet resilience, Germany focused on presenting an image of strength, unity, and a justified defensive posture. You might read newspaper articles extolling the virtues of German engineering or the efficiency of their organizational efforts. Radio broadcasts would emphasize the unwavering will of the leadership and the readiness of the armed forces, all delivered in a measured, confident tone. There were fewer overt threats against the Western Allies during this period, and more emphasis on internal cohesion and the inevitability of their historical destiny. It was a more grandiose form of quiet confidence, a sort of whispered boast about inevitable triumph, rather than a direct challenge. One quirky tidbit from this period is the role of humor in British propaganda. The Ministry of Information, recognizing the need to keep morale up without resorting to alarmism, employed cartoonists like Fougas, Cyril Kenneth Bird. His witty, often self-deprecating drawings, published in magazines like Punch and then reproduced as posters, offered light-hearted warnings about everything from dimming your headlights during blackouts to avoiding gossip. You might see a cartoon of a bumbling spy being foiled by a vigilant citizen, or a humorous depiction of the challenges of wartime rationing. These weren't laugh-out-loud jokes, but rather gentle chuckles that acknowledged the absurdities of the situation while reinforcing important messages. It was a clever way to engage the public, making them feel like they were in on the joke, even as they were being subtly instructed. It was like your favorite podcast host making a wry observation about a mundane task. It makes the task seem less daunting, doesn't it? The radio, in particular, became a central pillar of this gentle propaganda. As you sit by the crackling fire, listening to the wireless, you hear not just news bulletins, but also entertainment designed to uplift and distract. There are comedy shows, musical programs, and even dramas that subtly reinforce patriotic themes or the importance of community. The voices are calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic. It's a constant, gentle hum in the background of your daily life, a sonic blanket woven from carefully curated sounds and words. You're not being told to fight, you're being told to listen, to trust, to endure. Newspapers, too, played their part. You unfold the broadsheet, perhaps catching the faint scent of ink, and scan the headlines. While there might be reports of naval skirmishes far out at sea, the focus on the Western Front is often on the mundane. Soldiers training, defenses being strengthened, the quiet preparations. Editorials discuss the importance of national unity, the need for patience, and the strength of character required to face an uncertain future. They didn't scream war. They calmly stated, "We are at war, but we're handling it." It was an exercise in managing expectations, keeping the public engaged without fueling panic or premature exuberance. Think of it this way. If a regular war is a high-octane action movie, the Phoney War was a slow-burn psychological thriller. And the propaganda was the subtle, atmospheric soundtrack, designed to build a sense of quiet tension and preparedness, rather than immediate, explosive action. You're not on the edge of your seat. You're leaning back, perhaps with a cup of tea, absorbing the quiet drama. This period also saw governments subtly preparing their populations for the hardships to come, not through fear-mongering, but through practical advice and a sense of shared purpose. You'd receive leaflets about air raid precautions, not as a warning of imminent danger, but as sensible steps for a responsible citizen. You'd learn about rationing, not as a deprivation, but as a fair distribution of resources, ensuring everyone got their share. It was all about framing potential difficulties as manageable challenges, overcome through collective effort and quiet determination. It was like being given a detailed packing list for a trip you weren't entirely sure you were going on, but felt compelled to prepare for nonetheless. Historians still argue whether this gentle, almost apologetic approach to wartime propaganda was truly effective in preparing the populace for the brutal realities that would eventually erupt. Some suggest it fostered a sense of complacency, making the shock of the Blitz and the fall of France even more profound when they finally arrived. Others contend that it was precisely what was needed, a way to maintain morale and prevent widespread panic during a period of immense uncertainty, allowing people to adapt gradually to the idea of a prolonged conflict. It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? Was it a stroke of genius in psychological warfare, or a miscalculation that underestimated the public's capacity for direct truth? The sheer volume of these subtle messages, permeating every aspect of public life, was remarkable. From the local cinema showing newsreels of soldiers quietly training, to the government-sponsored public lectures on nutrition during wartime, the message was consistent. Be calm, be prepared, be resilient. You were being gently guided, like a sleepy child being led to bed, assured that everything would be all right, even as the distant rumble of potential conflict lingered on the horizon. It was a unique moment in the history of communication, where governments were essentially performing a high-wire act, maintaining a state of war readiness without triggering mass hysteria, and keeping morale high without having any grand victories to trumpet. They walked a fine line, using soft power and gentle persuasion, aiming for quiet fortitude rather than fiery patriotism. You might even feel a sense of quiet admiration for the sheer strategic patience involved, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones delivered in a whisper, not a shout. And so, as the quiet winter nights stretched on, and the spring slowly began to unfurl, you continued to live under this canopy of subtle comforts. The world outside might have been at war, but your daily life, guided by these gentle, reassuring messages, maintained a strange, almost dreamlike normalcy. It was a quiet preparation, a mental and emotional bracing for a storm that everyone knew was coming, but which had, for the moment, chosen to remain just beyond the horizon, leaving only the soft echo of its approach. You find yourself in a world that has declared war, yet seems oddly reluctant to fight it. It's like being invited to a massive, dramatic party, only to arrive and discover everyone is just standing around awkwardly, sipping lukewarm punch. You're at war, officially. Your nation is mobilizing. Your news reports are filled with updates from far-off fronts, or the lack thereof. Yet your personal, everyday life has settled into a strange, unsettling rhythm. This wasn't the heroic charge or the desperate defense you might have imagined from history books. This was waiting, a collective, global holding of breath. And so you adapt. As dusk descends, you pull the heavy, scratchy blackout curtains across your windows, plunging your home into a deliberate darkness. The world outside becomes a silhouette, a hushed landscape where streetlights are hooded, casting only a faint, downward glow, if they're on at all. Walking at night becomes a tentative shuffle, your hands outstretched, feeling for familiar walls, stumbling over unseen obstacles. It's a sensory deprivation experiment on a national scale, and you quickly learn the topography of your own street by memory and the feel of the pavement beneath your worn shoes. You probably have a few near misses with lampposts you didn't quite spot in time. Honestly, you'd think after months of this, they'd have issued night vision goggles, but alas, budgets, you know. Then there are the gas masks. Everyone had one. You were issued yours, a rubbery, slightly unsettling contraption that smelled faintly of chemicals and newness. Children carried theirs to school in little cardboard boxes, a somewhat morbid fashion accessory, or perhaps, for the more creatively inclined, a very specific type of Halloween costume they probably hoped they'd never actually need to use. You might even have tried it on a few times just to see how it felt, how muffled your voice became, how restricted your breathing. The drills became commonplace, the wail of the air raid siren, a sound that would send a shiver down your spine, even when you knew it was just a practice. You'd gather your family, perhaps grab a book or a deck of cards, and trudge down to the designated shelter, whether it was a reinforced basement or a communal trench. You'd sit there in the damp, cool air, listening to the muffled sounds from above, sharing hushed conversations with your neighbors, waiting for the all-clear. It was a peculiar blend of anxiety and boredom, a stark reminder of the threat that hung over everything, yet never quite materialized. Rationing, too, began to subtly weave its way into the fabric of daily life. Even if full, strict rationing wasn't yet universally applied to everything, the message was clear: conserve. You learned to make do, to stretch ingredients, to appreciate every scrap. Queues might form at shops, not for a shortage of goods necessarily, but for the anticipation of them, or for the shared experience of waiting. You might find yourself swapping recipes with neighbors, trying to figure out how to make a satisfying meal out of, well, not very much. It was a lesson in creative culinary minimalism, long before farm-to-table became a trendy phrase. You were more like pantry to plate, with a lot of hope and a prayer. The psychological toll of this waiting game was immense, yet often unseen. You lived in a state of perpetual readiness, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everyday life. Every news bulletin was listened to with bated breath, every rumor dissected. Was this the day? Would the quiet finally shatter? This constant anticipation could be exhausting, like perpetually bracing yourself for a sneeze that never comes. You found yourself scanning the skies, listening for the drone of unseen aircraft, even on the clearest, most peaceful days. The very stillness of the war became its own kind of weapon, eroding certainty, fostering a quiet dread. It was a bit like being trapped in the world's longest, most suspenseful trailer, where the main feature never starts, and you're starting to wonder if it ever will. Yet humanity, being the wonderfully adaptable species it is, found ways to cope. You saw communities pull closer together. Neighbors looked out for neighbors, sharing news, offering help, and perhaps most importantly, sharing laughter. Humor, even dark humor, became a vital coping mechanism. There were jokes about the futility of blackouts, when everyone knew where everything was anyway, or the absurdity of gas masks that smelled like old bicycle tires. People organized amateur theatricals, listened to the radio, and found solace in shared routines. It was an unspoken agreement. We are in this together, and we will wait it out, even if it feels like we're waiting for Godot, but with more sandbags. This period, often referred to as the Sitzkrieg by Germans, meaning sitting war, truly saw the widespread implementation of civil defense measures across Britain and France. For instance, Britain alone distributed over 38 million gas masks to its civilian population by the end of 1939, a colossal logistical undertaking designed to protect against chemical attacks that, thankfully, never materialized on the scale anticipated. And for a truly quirky tidbit, the British government, in its infinite wisdom and concern for civilian morale, actually published pamphlets advising people on how to deal with the boredom of sitting in air raid shelters. One such piece of advice suggested playing card games or even, rather optimistically, learning a new language. Imagine trying to conjugate French verbs while nervously listening for distant thuds. It's a testament to the sheer, mundane strangeness of the time. The paradox was stark. You were a nation at war, yet your soldiers weren't fighting, your factories weren't yet fully geared for mass destruction, and your daily life, while altered, wasn't shattered by bombs. It was a war of nerves, of preparation, of potential. You sent your sons and husbands off to join units that trained endlessly, polished equipment, and waited behind formidable defenses like the Maginot Line, which, let's be honest, became less a military stronghold and more a very expensive, very quiet underground hotel for thousands of bored soldiers. They were ready, poised, but the curtains simply refused to rise. This led to a peculiar kind of psychological fatigue, a weariness born not of battle, but of endless anticipation. Historians still debate whether this period of prolonged inaction, this Phoney War, ultimately served to strengthen or weaken the resolve of the Allied nations. Did it allow them crucial time to prepare, to build up their forces and industries, or did it foster a dangerous complacency, a false sense of security that left them unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the real war when it finally broke out? There are compelling arguments on both sides, suggesting that while some vital preparations were made, the lack of immediate threat may have dulled the edge of urgency in certain quarters. You learned to live with the paradox. You learned to find routine in the uncertainty, to find comfort in the mundane. You learned to knit socks for soldiers who weren't yet fighting, to cultivate small victory gardens in anticipation of future shortages, and to listen to the radio not just for news, but for entertainment, for a brief escape from the quiet tension. It was a testament to the quiet resilience of ordinary people, adapting to an extraordinary situation that was defined by its very lack of action. You were at war, yes, but for now, it was a war fought in the shadows of your mind, in the quiet preparations of your home, and in the collective, patient breath of a continent holding still. You were living the unfought war, a gentle, unsettling prelude to the storm. As the Phoney War settled into its peculiar rhythm across Western Europe, a stark and chilling counterpoint began to play out far, far to the north, a brutal, frozen echo of what war truly was. While you were perhaps sipping tea in a blackout-curtained living room, or quietly patrolling a silent trench, an entirely different kind of conflict was raging in the desolate, snow-laden landscapes of Finland. This was not a war of waiting, but of immediate, unyielding brutality, a visceral reminder that while one part of the world held its breath, another was exhaling plumes of frozen vapor in a desperate fight for survival. Imagine, if you will, the deepest, most unforgiving winter you can possibly conceive. We're talking about temperatures that would make your eyelashes freeze together, where the very air crystallizes in your lungs, and the snow piles up in drifts so high they swallow entire buildings. This was the stage upon which the Winter War unfolded, a conflict that began when the Soviet Union, driven by territorial demands and strategic concerns, launched a massive invasion of tiny Finland on November 30th, 1939. It was a move that shocked the world, a colossal bear lunging at a valiant, if vastly outmatched, badger. The quiet declarations of war in September suddenly seemed like a distant, almost polite, formality compared to the raw, unadulterated aggression now unleashed upon the Finnish people. While the Maginot Line stood silently, its vast bunkers filled with soldiers awaiting an unseen enemy, the Finnish border was anything but quiet. The Soviets poured across, an overwhelming force of some 500,000 men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, expecting a swift, decisive victory. They anticipated, perhaps, a brief and chilly parade through Helsinki, followed by a warm cup of cocoa and a hearty pat on the back. Oh, how wrong they were. The Finns, numbering a mere 250,000 active and reserve troops, faced this Goliath with little more than their fierce independence, an intimate knowledge of their brutal terrain, and a truly remarkable ability to endure unimaginable cold. You might think, well, they're used to the cold, right? But nobody is used to minus 40 degrees Celsius when you're trying to fight a war. That's just a different level of chilly, where your breath freezes on your beard and your rifle can seize up faster than you can say Molotov cocktail. The initial Soviet advance was a logistical nightmare for them, a masterclass in how not to invade a country in the dead of winter. Their troops, often poorly equipped for the extreme cold, wore thin uniforms, lacked proper winter boots, and were frequently supplied with summer maps. Imagine trying to navigate a featureless, snow-covered forest with a map that shows trees that are now buried under 10 feet of snow. It's like trying to find your way through a maze blindfolded, except the maze is also trying to freeze you solid. The Finns, by contrast, moved like ghosts through their white-blanketed homeland, dressed in pristine white camouflage, gliding on skis, and striking with devastating precision. They were the ultimate home team, playing on a field only they understood, while the away team stumbled around, slipping on the ice. This conflict, though geographically distant, served as a stark, icy slap in the face for the nations wrapped in the Phoney War's gentle embrace. It ripped away any lingering illusions that modern warfare might be a polite, contained affair. Here, you saw the true face of attrition, the brutal calculus of lives lost for inches of frozen ground. The Finns developed ingenious tactics, most famously the Matti, Finnish for log pile or pocket, strategy. This involved allowing Soviet units to penetrate deep into the dense forests, then encircling and cutting them off into smaller, isolated pockets, which were then systematically destroyed. It was a bit like a highly organized, very deadly game of whack-a-mole, where the moles were entire Soviet divisions. These Matti battles were horrific, with Soviet soldiers freezing, starving, and fighting to the last man in their trapped, snowbound enclaves. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge from this frigid crucible was a Finnish farmer named Simo Haiha, who would become known as the White Death. This isn't just a quirky tidbit, it's a legend. Operating almost entirely alone, dressed in his white camouflage, Haiha used a Finnish-made Mosin-Nagant rifle without a telescopic sight. He preferred iron sights to avoid glare that might reveal his position, and a Suomi KP/-31 submachine gun. In just 100 days, he was credited with over 500 confirmed kills, making him the deadliest sniper in history. Think about that for a moment. 500 kills. In the freezing cold. Without a fancy scope. It's like something out of a video game, except it was terrifyingly real. He'd pack snow in front of his position to conceal his breath, and even keep snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from fogging up. Talk about dedication to your craft. For the watching world, particularly those in Britain and France who were still wondering where their war had gone, the Winter War was a grim, unvarnished preview. You saw the devastating power of artillery, the relentless advance of tanks, and the sheer human cost of holding a line against overwhelming odds. The international community, largely paralyzed by the Phoney War itself, offered only limited assistance. Volunteers from various countries, including Britain, Sweden, and the United States, made their way to Finland, drawn by a sense of moral outrage or a thirst for real combat, but their numbers were a mere trickle against the Soviet flood. Supplies, too, were scarce, often delayed by the very logistical challenges that plagued the Soviets. It was a lonely fight, fought in the deep snow, largely unwitnessed by the world's major powers who were still waiting for their own war to begin. The League of Nations, that grand experiment in international cooperation, actually managed to do something, albeit something symbolic. It expelled the Soviet Union in December 1939 for its aggression against Finland. This was a mainstream historical fact, a rare moment where the League acted decisively against a major power, even if it had little practical effect on the ground in the Karelian Isthmus. It was a diplomatic equivalent of a very stern wag of the finger, while the actual fighting continued unabated. Despite the Finns' incredible resistance and their tactical brilliance, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and resources eventually began to tell. The Soviets, learning from their initial blunders, improved their tactics, brought in better-equipped troops, and simply kept throwing men and material at the Finnish lines. The Finnish defenses, though valiant, were stretched to their absolute breaking point. You can only hold out against an army 10 times your size for so long, no matter how many Molotov cocktails you invent. Yes, the petrol bomb was famously nicknamed after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov by the Finns, who sarcastically called them Molotov bread baskets, after the Soviets claimed they were dropping food, not bombs. By March 1940, with their resources dwindling and their lines buckling, Finland was forced to seek peace. The Moscow Peace Treaty, signed on March 13, 1940, ceded significant territory to the Soviet Union, including the Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri. It was a harsh peace for Finland, but it preserved their independence, a remarkable achievement given the odds. The cost was immense, over 25,000 Finnish lives lost, and countless more wounded or displaced. The Soviet losses were staggering, estimated to be well over 120,000 dead and hundreds of thousands wounded, a testament to the ferocity of the Finnish defense and the ineptitude of the initial Soviet command. Historians still argue whether the high Soviet casualties in the winter war truly impacted Hitler's calculations when he planned Operation Barbarossa, leading him to underestimate the Soviet military's potential for resilience and eventual recovery. Did the Finns, in their heroic struggle, inadvertently contribute to a later, even larger conflict? It's a fascinating, if grim, thought. The Winter War was a stark, bloody meteor streaking across the quiet, gray sky of the Phoney War. It was a harsh lesson, delivered in sub-zero temperatures. That war, when it truly began, was a terrifying, all-consuming force. For those in Western Europe, cocooned in their strange, unfought conflict, it was a distant echo, yes, but one that resonated deeply. It reminded them that the quietude they enjoyed was a fragile, temporary state, and that the true nature of conflict was far more brutal, far more demanding, than anything they had yet experienced. It was a grim preview of the storm that was, slowly but surely, gathering on their own horizons, waiting for the gentle ending of quietude to unveil its full, terrifying might. You could almost hear the wind whipping across the frozen Finnish lakes, carrying with it the whisper of what was to come. You've grown accustomed by now to the gentle hum of the unfought war, the quiet rhythm of nations holding their breath. But even the deepest slumber can be punctuated by a sudden jolt, a brief, sharp reminder that the world hasn't quite forgotten its declarations. While the land fronts remained largely dormant, a different kind of theater unfolded upon the vast, restless expanse of the sea. Here, isolated incidents, like ripples spreading across a calm pond, occasionally broke the surface of the Phoney War's placid waters, serving as fleeting, contained echoes of the conflict that was, supposedly, already underway. Imagine, if you will, the vast, cold emptiness of the North Atlantic in those early months. It's a place where the wind always whispers secrets, and the waves never cease their ancient, hypnotic rhythm. Far from the watchful eyes of armies, a quiet, deadly game of hide-and-seek was playing out. German U-boats, like silent predators, would occasionally slip through the waves, seeking out merchant convoys. And while the major, dramatic naval battles you might associate with later stages of the war were still largely absent, the sinking of a lone freighter, or a brief, desperate exchange between a submarine and a destroyer, would send a shiver through the Allied command. These weren't grand engagements, mind you, more like a flick of a fish tail in the deep, reminding you something was alive down there, even if you couldn't quite see it. It was the maritime equivalent of someone occasionally dropping a teacup in the kitchen while everyone else was trying to sleep. Annoying, certainly, but not quite a full-blown party. But then there was the Altmark affair. Ah, the Altmark. Now this was less a teacup and more like a small, very specific, very important, and legally dubious china cabinet being smashed. For a moment, the quiet, almost polite, nature of the Phoney War was shattered by a burst of high-stakes drama, a real-life thriller unfolding on the icy Norwegian coast. If you were following the news at the time, perhaps listening to a crackly radio in a blackout-darkened room, this was the kind of story that made you sit up a little straighter, a jolt of genuine wartime tension in an otherwise uneventful period. The Altmark was no ordinary ship. She was the supply vessel for the formidable German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, a ship that had wreaked havoc on Allied shipping in the South Atlantic before its dramatic scuttling off Montevideo in December 1939. You might recall the Graf Spee's saga, a sleek, powerful raider that had sunk 9 merchant ships before cornering itself. The Altmark's job had been to rendezvous with the Graf Spee at sea, providing fuel, provisions, and, crucially, taking on board the hundreds of Allied merchant sailors captured from those sunken vessels. So while the Graf Spee went down, the Altmark, with her human cargo, slipped away, beginning a long, perilous journey home, hoping to pass unnoticed through the vast, neutral waters of the Atlantic. She was a ghost ship, carrying secrets and, more importantly, over 300 British prisoners, deep within her holds. Consider the quiet internal monologues. Churchill, perhaps pacing his office late at night, a half-eaten cigar smoldering in an ashtray, muttering about the need for action, not words. He knew that Britain's industrial capacity needed to be fully mobilized, that the Royal Navy, while formidable, would face unprecedented challenges. He was already thinking about the air war, the need for Spitfires and Hurricanes, even as the skies above remained largely peaceful. He was a man who understood the long game, even if he preferred the short, decisive punch. His mind was a battlefield of its own, constantly fighting hypothetical scenarios, always seeking the advantage. Hitler, on the other hand, in his own private moments, was probably consumed by a mix of impatience and a chilling self-belief. He had achieved so much with his blitzkrieg in Poland. Why would the West be any different? He was convinced of the superiority of his military doctrine, the speed, the shock, the coordinated power of tanks and air support. He was a master manipulator, not just of people but of perceptions. He wanted the Allies to remain passive, to continue their quiet preparations, because it bought him time to perfect his own. It was like watching someone slowly, methodically, assemble a very large, very dangerous IKEA furniture piece, while you're still trying to figure out which end of the Allen key goes where. Historians still argue whether Hitler genuinely believed Britain and France would sue for peace during this period, or if he always intended a full-scale Western offensive. Some scholars suggest he harbored a hope that his initial conquest of Poland would lead to a negotiated settlement, allowing him to consolidate his gains. Others contend that the blitzkrieg against the West was an inevitable, predetermined next step in his grand, terrifying vision for European domination. Was he truly surprised by the Allied declarations of war, or did he simply see them as an irritating but ultimately inconsequential formality? The quiet calculations of his mind remain a subject of intense academic debate, a silent tug-of-war in the annals of history. The leaders were also making quiet calculations about their own domestic situations. Churchill, still battling the legacy of appeasement, was working to galvanize a nation that had grown weary of war, even one unfought. He understood the psychological toll of the quietude, the slow erosion of morale that could come from waiting for the axe to fall. He was already preparing the ground for his eventual leadership, subtly shaping public opinion, always with an eye on the bigger picture. His speeches, even from the Admiralty, were like quiet thunder, hinting at the storm to come. He was preparing the British people, not just for battle, but for endurance. Hitler, conversely, was consolidating his power, ensuring his military and political apparatus were entirely aligned with his vision. He faced less internal dissent, certainly, but he still needed to maintain the narrative of German strength and unstoppable momentum. The Phoney War, in a perverse way, served as propaganda machine. It allowed him to portray the Allies as weak and indecisive, unwilling to truly fight. Look, he might have implied, they declared war, but they don't do anything. They're all talk, no walk. It was a clever, if chilling, manipulation of the strange quiet. You can almost feel the weight of their decisions, the enormity of the stakes, pressing down on these men in their private chambers. The clinking of a teacup, the scratch of a pen, the soft rustle of a uniform as a general shifts in his seat. These were the only sounds in rooms where the fate of millions was being quietly determined. They were playing a global game of chess, but with real countries as pieces, and the lives of real people as pawns. And unlike a normal chess game, there was no clock ticking down, just the relentless, silent march of time towards an inevitable confrontation. This period was a test of nerves for everyone, but especially for the leaders. They had to balance the need for preparation with the risk of provocation. They had to maintain national morale without resorting to false alarms. It was a delicate, almost balletic, dance on the precipice of global conflict. You can imagine the late-night phone calls, the encrypted messages, the hushed conversations that shaped the very fabric of the coming storm. They were all aware that the curtain would soon rise on a much more active and devastating act. The silence was not peace, it was merely the deep breath before the plunge. And they, the quiet calculators, were the ones taking that breath. You know, for a time, you could almost forget there was a war on. It was like one of those long, slow-motion movie scenes where the camera just lingers on a tranquil landscape, and you're lulled into a false sense of security. The Phoney War had settled in so deeply, so comfortably, that it almost felt normal. You'd wake up, go about your day, perhaps grumble about the rationing or the blackout curtains, but the true, visceral terror of conflict felt like a distant nightmare, something that happened to other people in other times. It was a bizarre, almost cozy suspension of reality. But as the days lengthened, as the gentle, fragile quietude of winter began to yield to the first tentative whispers of spring, you could almost feel it in the air, couldn't you? That soft, almost imperceptible shift. The illusion of calm, that delicate, shimmering veil, began to thin. It wasn't a sudden tear, mind you, no dramatic ripping sound. Oh no, that would have been far too abrupt for our gentle narrative. Instead, it was more like a fine mist slowly dissipating with the rising sun, revealing the sharper, more defined contours of the world beneath. Or perhaps, think of it like that moment in a dream when you start to realize something is just a little bit off, and the edges of your dream world begin to fray. You still feel mostly safe, but a tiny prickle of unease starts to crawl up your spine. You might notice it first in the newspapers. The headlines, which for months had been filled with domestic news, rationing updates, or vague reports of diplomatic efforts, now carried a slightly sharper edge. The language became less about holding the line and more about vigilance and preparedness. The photographs, which had often shown soldiers looking rather bored or civilians cheerfully adapting to new regulations, now seemed to hint at a deeper tension, a furrowed brow here, a tightening of the jaw there. Even the propaganda posters, which had previously offered comforting reassurances and patriotic platitudes, started to subtly shift their tone, hinting at a coming storm, urging a new kind of resolve. It was as if the collective subconscious of Europe was stirring from a long, strange slumber, sensing that the game of quiet chess was about to become something far more physical. You'd hear it in the conversations, too. The casual chatter in the queues for bread or at the local pub would take on a different timbre. Less complaining about the price of eggs, more hushed speculation about what they were planning. You'd see people glancing nervously at the sky, even on a clear day, as if expecting to see something that wasn't there yet, but would be soon. This growing unease wasn't just a British or French phenomenon. It was a subtle, pervasive current flowing across the continent, even in Germany, where the quietude had been a deliberate strategic choice. The psychological toll of this prolonged, unfought war was beginning to manifest as a low-level hum of anxiety, a growing impatience with the waiting. It was like being perpetually on the verge of a sneeze, knowing it's coming, but never quite getting it out. Quite annoying, really, for the continent. On the ground, particularly along the Maginot Line, the quiet might still reign, but the men within those vast concrete fortresses felt the shift. Their patrols became a little more vigilant, their watches a little longer. The boredom that had been their primary enemy was slowly being replaced by a nervous anticipation. They were polishing their boots less out of routine and more out of a grim determination, an almost superstitious belief that a well-shined shoe might somehow ward off the inevitable. You could almost hear them muttering, "Well, at least if we do fight, our boots will be immaculate." Can't say the same for the enemy, probably. A small comfort, perhaps, but a comfort nonetheless. And what about the intelligence communities, those shadowy figures working behind the scenes? Well, they were certainly feeling the pressure. Reports, which had previously been thin on concrete details, began to pile up with increasing frequency. Whispers of troop movements, aerial reconnaissance showing new patterns, coded messages hinting at strategic preparations. This was the period when the Allies became increasingly concerned about German intentions in Scandinavia. You see, the neutral nations of Norway and Sweden were vital for Germany's war machine, particularly for their iron or supplies. The Allies, growing increasingly restless with the Phoney Wars in action, began to contemplate their own moves to disrupt these supplies, perhaps even to establish a new front in the north. This was a mainstream historical fact that underscored the thinning of the calm. The quiet strategic jockeying for position was intensifying, and the Arctic chill was about to get a lot warmer with geopolitical heat. The subtle signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. Even quirky little tidbits started to emerge, reflecting the heightened tension. For instance, in Britain, with the constant underlying fear of invasion, there was a peculiar surge in civilian invasion anxiety. People started reporting unusual lights, strange noises, and even suspicious foreigners, convinced they were spotting German paratroopers or fifth columnists, traitors working from within. One particularly amusing, and perhaps a bit sad, anecdote from this period involved a woman who reported her neighbor for acting suspiciously because he was observed speaking German to his dog. Now, one can only imagine the poor dog's confusion, or perhaps its sheer delight at finally understanding its master's true linguistic preferences. It was a testament to how the prolonged tension was starting to fray nerves, leading to some truly bizarre interpretations of everyday life. Historians still debate whether the Allied inaction during this thinning period was a strategic blunder or an unavoidable consequence of political and military realities. Was there a genuine opportunity to strike a decisive blow against Germany before they had fully mobilized? Or were the Allies simply not prepared, both militarily and psychologically, for a large-scale offensive, making the Phoney War an unfortunate but necessary period of rearmament and strategic reassessment? It's a complex question, one that keeps many a scholar up at night, pondering the what-ifs of history. You see, even in the quietest moments, the echoes of potential decisions reverberate through time, inviting endless contemplation. As the days stretched into weeks, the subtle shift became more pronounced. You could sense the collective holding of breath. It was as if the entire continent was a gigantic pendulum, having swung to one extreme of quietude, and was now slowly, inexorably, beginning its return swing towards the other. The silence was no longer comforting. It was pregnant with unspoken menace, a vast, waiting emptiness. The gentle sounds of spring, the chirping of birds, the rustling of new leaves, seemed almost too fragile against the growing undercurrent of foreboding. It was like listening to a symphony orchestra tuning up, the individual instruments playing their own notes, creating a cacophony, but hinting at the grand, unified piece that was about to begin. You knew the conductor was about to raise his baton, and the true performance was just around the corner. The quiet preparations, the logistical shifts, the increasing tempo of intelligence gathering, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. The phony part of the war was drawing to an end. The comfort of the unfought conflict was dissolving, replaced by a growing, undeniable certainty that the real fighting, the true, brutal nature of war, was about to make its grand, unwelcome entrance. It was like that moment when you've been watching a particularly tense movie, and the background music, which had been subtle and atmospheric, suddenly swells, and you know deep in your bones that the jump scare or the big action sequence is finally about to happen. You brace yourself, knowing that the gentle, almost sleepy narrative you've been following is about to be jolted wide awake. You feel it in the air, a subtle shift that whispers of change. The relentless, bone-deep chill of winter, which had settled over Western Europe like a weighted blanket, begins to recede. You notice the sun lingering a little longer each evening, painting the sky with hues of rose and gold that were absent during the short, gray days of December and January. The ground, once hard and unforgiving, starts to soften, releasing the earthy scent of thawing soil. A faint green blush appears on the branches of trees, and you hear the tentative, hopeful chirping of birds, returning from their southern retreats. Spring, gentle and insistent, is quietly nudging the world awake. This seasonal awakening mirrors a deeper, more unsettling stirring in the strategic quietude that has defined your existence for months. The Phoney War, that bizarre, almost polite pause in the grand drama of global conflict, feels like it's subtly thinning, like an old, beloved sweater that's seen too many winters. The illusion of calm, once so comforting in its predictability, now feels more like a flimsy veil, stretched taut, threatening to tear at any moment. You've grown accustomed to the rhythm of this unfought war, the blackouts, the rationing, the drills that felt more like elaborate charades than genuine preparations. You've mastered the art of living in a state of suspended animation, where the loudest sound of war was often the rustle of a newspaper or the distant drone of a reconnaissance plane. It was like being perpetually on hold with customer service, knowing eventually someone would pick up, but never quite sure when. But now the dial tone is getting louder. The air hums with a different kind of energy, a tension that's less about waiting for if something will happen, and more about when. You start to notice subtle shifts. News reports, once filled with vague reassurances and updates on agricultural quotas, now carry a sharper edge, hinting at military movements and diplomatic deadlocks. The propaganda posters, which for months depicted stoic citizens calmly knitting socks for soldiers, begin to show more resolute faces, chins jutting out, eyes fixed on a distant, determined future. It's as if the world has finally decided that enough is enough of this awkward silence, and it's time to break the ice, perhaps with a very large, very loud hammer. The soldiers, who had settled into a routine of card games, training exercises, and perhaps a surprising amount of gardening in their downtime along the Maginot Line or in their British barracks, feel it too. The sense of routine, which had become their unexpected comfort, begins to fray. Inspections become more rigorous, leave passes become scarcer, and the distant rumble of transport vehicles sounds less like a benign delivery and more like an ominous procession. They've spent months perfecting the art of defensive boredom, and now, suddenly, it feels like they might actually have to put their training to use. It's a bit like finally getting to use that emergency exit you've walked past every day, only to realize you're not entirely sure where it leads. On the German side, the calculated silence, which had been Hitler's strategic masterpiece, also begins to show its cracks. While the Western allies had been content to wait, hoping the economic blockade and their defensive lines would deter further aggression, Hitler had been refining his plans, his gaze fixed northward. The lull had served its purpose, allowing Germany to consolidate its gains from the Polish campaign and rearm, but the window for decisive action was closing. The spring thaw, which brought life back to the land, also brought the possibility of unhindered naval movements and clearer skies for air operations. It was the perfect stage for a dramatic entrance, and Hitler was never one to miss a cue. You might have heard whispers, hushed conversations in pubs or across garden fences, about the growing naval activity in the North Sea. The U-boats, which had been a quiet menace throughout the winter, seemed to be venturing further, their movements more aggressive. Supply convoys, once relatively unmolested, now faced increased threats. These weren't isolated incidents anymore. They felt like the opening chords of a symphony, building to a crescendo. The sea, always a subtle battlefield, was becoming less subtle by the day. Then, quite suddenly, the quiet prelude drew to its gentle, yet decisive close. On April 9, 1940, the curtain rose on a new act, not in the expected Western Front, but far to the north. Germany launched Operation Weserübung, a swift and overwhelming invasion of Denmark and Norway. This was the moment the Phoney War ceased to be phony. Denmark, caught completely by surprise, capitulated within hours, its forces barely able to mount a defense. It was so fast, some people probably didn't even finish their morning coffee before it was all over. Talk about an express delivery of conflict. Norway, with its rugged fjords and strategic ports, put up a more spirited resistance, aided by Allied expeditionary forces, but the sheer speed and coordination of the German assault were devastating. This invasion was a mainstream historical fact that completely shattered the illusion of calm. It wasn't a skirmish, it was a full-scale, audacious military operation that demonstrated Germany's capacity for rapid, decisive action. For months, the world had been holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now it didn't just drop, it landed with a resounding thud in Scandinavia, sending shockwaves across the continent. You realize, with a chill that has nothing to do with the receding winter, that the war you've been preparing for, but not fighting, has finally arrived. A quirky, almost overlooked detail from this period, which perhaps highlights the abruptness of the shift, is how many of the German invasion plans for Norway were initially reliant on the weather clearing. The meticulous German military planners, known for their precision, were at the mercy of the elements. There were genuine concerns that the spring fogs and late winter storms might delay the amphibious landings and paratrooper drops. Imagine a global conflict hanging in the balance, waiting for a clear day, like a particularly important picnic. When the weather finally cooperated, it was as if fate itself was giving the green light for the Phoney War to finally pack its bags and leave. Historians still argue whether the Allies truly squandered the Phoney War period by not taking more proactive measures, or if their defensive posture was a necessary evil to prepare for the inevitable onslaught. Some argue that the time was wasted, allowing Germany to consolidate and rearm, while others contend that the Allies desperately needed those months to mobilize their industries and train their forces, which were simply not ready for a major offensive in late 1939. You can almost hear the academic debates echoing through the halls of history, a quiet, intellectual skirmish over a period of military inaction. As the news of the Scandinavian invasion spread, the atmosphere in London, Paris, and even Berlin shifted dramatically. The gentle sense of ordinary routine, which had been so carefully cultivated, evaporated. Blackouts suddenly felt less like a quaint inconvenience and more like a grim necessity. Evacuation plans, once practiced with a certain detachment, now carried an urgent, terrifying weight. The quiet calculations of leaders like Churchill, who had spent the winter rallying his nation with words of defiance, now had to translate into decisive action. Hitler, having successfully broken the quietude, was now poised to unleash the full force of his blitzkrieg on Western Europe. The long, gentle period of inaction had served its purpose, a strange, drawn-out overture to a symphony of destruction. It had allowed nations to take a collective breath, to prepare, to wonder, and perhaps to lull themselves into a false sense of security. But as spring unfurled its green banners, and the sounds of distant conflict grew louder, you knew, deep in your bones, that the quiet prelude was truly over. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the main act was about to begin. The world was about to learn that the Phoney War was just that, a deceptive calm before the storm, a gentle whisper before a deafening roar. And so, as the gentle spring breezes carry the scent of new blossoms and distant, unsettling news, you find yourself at the very edge of this unique historical chapter. The Phoney War may have been strange, uneventful, and even a little absurd in its quietude, but it was a real period of history, a collective holding of breath before the world plunged into the maelstrom. You've walked through its quiet streets, felt its peculiar tensions, and witnessed its subtle shifts. Now, as the narrative draws to a close for tonight, let your mind drift away from the echoes of declarations and the whispers of conflict. Imagine the soft rustle of leaves in the spring air, the comforting weight of a warm blanket, and the steady rhythm of your own breath. The historical journey we've taken together, through periods of quiet and calm, is designed to lull your thoughts, to gently guide you towards a peaceful stillness. Let the imagery of quiet nights, unlit cities, and patient waiting fade into the background of your consciousness. There's no urgency, no need to rush. Just the gentle ebb and flow of a story told, now receding like a calm tide. Allow any lingering thoughts of the past to dissolve into the quiet comfort of the present moment. Your mind is a peaceful lake, reflecting the soft glow of the moon.